So I'm getting together today with Siobhan Fitzgerald. Hello, Siobhan.
Hello, Vicky. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Myself and Siobhan have known each other a very long time, and we met both practitioners of Ashtanga Vinyasa with the same teacher, Paul Dallahan, in Thailand, and that's where we first met. And then we both got very interested in the breath because obviously Ashtanga Vinyasa is very much a dynamic form of yoga where the breath is involved a great deal. And both of us, because our teacher Paul Dallahan was already studying in-depth pranayama with Sri OP Tiwari from the Kaivalayadhama, of which we've both now studied extensively with. So we began this journey into pranayama, and we're going to do a series of videos beginning today about the subject and teaching of pranayama. And today we're going to focus on obviously the most important element of pranayama, which is just simply breathing, simply breathing, and
Simply breathe.
simply breathing. And I want to introduce the subject that we decided to focus on today, which is the importance of the respiratory diaphragm in the process of breathing. And my the most important point that I want to make today, and that we're going to discuss really in depth, is how it's way more important to show students and teach and practice how to open the breath. So it's not enough to just tell someone to breathe deeply. My feeling is that's a faulty narrative because most people have got into faulty breathing habits where the respiratory diaphragm has become tense because everyone's been bombarded by stress today, and this muscle which sits underneath the diaphragm becomes very restrictive. And so when we breathe in, we get into habits that don't utilize the entire breathing mechanism. So what tends to happen is there's a kind of shallow breath, and you can even see when I'm mimicking a shallow breath how the tension is brought into the neck muscles and the shoulders. And what we want to talk about today is how we need to educate everyone really in how to breathe more efficiently. So I'd just like to introduce my friend Siobhan Fitzgerald, and she's just going to introduce how she got interested in breathing.
How I get interested in breathing. Thank you, Vicky. Absolutely, from my first class ever in yoga, I had an amazing first experience with someone who taught us 20 minutes of pranayama at the beginning of every yoga class that she taught for me. And that is the thing that hooked me in, really, essentially. This lady was in her 70s and I was in my 20s. And I refused to go to these classes because I thought I wasn't going to get anything out of them. And the first time I went, I caved on her request for me to be there because she could see that I needed this in my life from being a client of mine. And I went. And this lady went to India 3 times a year. So she got the pranayama, the breathing from source. And she brought that essence back to where I am in Scotland and taught a very small group of us the pranayama practices, but she taught them well. And the whole point of you saying and referring to the respiratory diaphragm was essentially what was given to us in those first classes. Now, because this lady, Joanne, was in her late 70s, she retired. So I only had those first few years with her. And from that one class, I knew that I felt different. And that's why I continued. I felt different. So the feeling and the sensation that I had was a calm, one of calm when I left that class. And it was a calm like nothing I'd ever experienced before. And that's really essentially what hooked me in. But then it got lost in translation because there was nothing that I'd kept up except going to those classes. So I moved into different forms of yoga until I found Ashtanga. And then I think because the breathing was so strong in the Ashtanga system, that then hooked me into that form of dynamic yogic flow until I met Paul in Thailand and met Sri OP Tiwari. Because then really what we were given in breathing instruction was an entire program. And the entire program meets all the needs of the human body and all the needs of the nervous system and all the needs of the physiological problems that were going on in my body at that time. So although I was feeling better and gaining over 8 years of practice before I came to Paul in Thailand in 2005, there was no program that I was following in breath work. So it's very interesting how that taste lingered there for so many years before I actually got into the way of using it as a program for myself and a tool for myself to regulate my own system. And it's phenomenally transformative. We just in regular breathing and other breathing practices that are out there, we're not really taught these mechanisms. We're not taught about the pelvic floor. We're not taught about the abdomen. We're not taught about the difference between abdominal breathing and even diaphragmatic breathing. The very different response systems that are taking off in the body between using these mechanisms, and then when we bring them all together, it's transformative. It really, really is. But you know, a lot of breathing practices that are out there are just one formula, and that formula is stuck on a repeat. It's like being on a hamster wheel. You're never going to get anywhere. You're just doing one practice, and it might serve a very tiny purpose in calming you down, but it's not going to go any further than that. So the human body is saying, oh, okay, I got a little bit of relief from doing something like box breathing. But I might be doing box breathing from my chest. And like you demonstrated earlier, you know, when you're stressed, this tightens up.
Can I pick up on a point there?
You absolutely can, yes.
I think what's interesting about what you say is, you know, there's lots of breath techniques out there, but what it doesn't take into consideration is someone's state at the time when they start breathing, or any muscular tension in the body when they start these techniques. So someone's saying, for example, with a box breath, or someone's saying inhale for 5, exhale for 10. What happens when someone inhales for 5, if they haven't got the capacity to widen the breath, is then they might be inhaling again in a very high chest way and actually adding more stress to the body.
Absolutely.
So I think we're both coming from this perspective of not enough is being described about how to breathe. It's rather these techniques are just given out with some very simple instructions without acknowledging each individual needs to actually release the tension. For example, when I do my breath trainings, the first thing that we start is actually acknowledging that most people, and these trainings are aimed at, you know, anyone who's got an interest in health and breathing, but also teachers. And I think they haven't realized how much stress they've got until they start to massage underneath the rib cage. And what's illuminated there is this huge amount of stress. And I think if I remember,
It can be painful as well, Vicky, to actually push on these points, these key areas. Yeah.
yeah, and I don't know whether you remember, but back in the day when we were both doing quite a strong Ashtanga Vinyasa practice, and I would be doing it 5 days a week, and I would say, I'm going to fit my practice in before work. And I hadn't realized until I was introduced to pranayama through Paul that actually the way in which I was breathing in my Ashtanga practice was ineffective. That much of the time I was maybe over breathing, going too fast. And so I don't know whether you've noticed this, Siobhan, but as I train teachers or train people to become teachers, what I'm noticing is that even at a very class level of yoga, dynamic postures, there's very little shared about how to breathe efficiently through dynamic postures. Would you agree?
I would 100% agree, Vicky. And I think for the main part, the reason behind that is that some of these, and I'm not dissing anyone for any 1 second or moment here, but there's not enough taught about how. There's not enough understanding about how. And in fact, there's a lot of teacher training programs out there at a basic level where they barely touch on the breathing at all. And for the best part of those programs, it's very, very much alignment focused in the different postures that people are working on. And when you speed that up into a vinyasa flow without understanding the breathing mechanisms, or you've actually not had that window, that part of time. I spent a whole day last week teaching my teacher trainees these exact mechanisms, and it was incredible how the energy changed in the room just from the most simple access to an awareness to release these parts of the breathing mechanisms in the body. There's not enough understood. I feel personally there's not enough understood about it, and that's why it's not developed in teacher training programs. And I think that we just carry on with the basic yoga, but above the level of understanding that deeper concept of how breathing mechanisms truly work. Because when they truly work, we get transformation. And so we
Yeah,
can reflect on that, even that there's a lot of people out there that are teachers, but they've not evolved. That everything still sits on a plateau of where they are with, and I'm obviously talking about breathing here, their breathing mechanism in their own body, in their own system.
can I just pick up on that? Because I think people actually, and here we are, we're going back to the roots of yoga.
Yeah,
I think what we are both picking up on here is the fact that in the West, we see yoga as purely as some kind of form of physical exercise, and not enough is known about the roots of yoga, which actually, when we look back historically, there were very few postures, and what was the focus of yoga was in fact the breath. And as you've stated there, so many teacher trainings miss that element out or skim over it, which is to me a dilution. And we've discussed this before. It's very much a dilution of the origins of yoga.
Mhm.
Now, one of the first things that we do on the teacher training that I run is we spend the weekend with the breath.
Yeah.
And what I would hope to teach in that first weekend is how you can shift the nervous system very quickly
Yeah.
by focusing on, again, opening up the space within the body, massaging, very simple movements to stretch and open the space. So we do some movement to open the space and
Yeah.
to actually get the breathing mechanism working much more efficiently. And so we do very little yoga postures, we tend to focus much more on unlocking the muscles that restrict the breath to begin with. And what I'm going to mention here is the psoas muscle, which most people perhaps underestimate, is a major part of the restriction of the breath. So that the psoas muscle runs down either side of from the pelvic crest up underneath the rib cage and is attached to the fascia around the diaphragm. Most people's psoas is unbelievably stressed because of the way we sit, we drive, we're on constant overdrive, and that muscle becomes tighter and tighter. And so we've become very short in our breath as a result of that one major muscle. And so that particular weekend we spend just unlocking that muscle, and it illuminates to the students how they have never before, in such a short space of time, watched and observed their own nervous system shifting.
Mm-hmm.
Very simply. And I think we don't tend to, and within an ordinary yoga class, a weekly yoga class, not enough is demonstrated about the physiology of the body. Would you agree?
Oh, 100%. 100%. And I think, even looking at, going back to what you said, Vicky, about the physical aspect of yoga, there's, if we look back at ancient texts, asanas, these physical postures, they were barely mentioned. There was only one or two references to them, really. And many references to the breath again and again. But I think understanding the physiological pathway of the breath and where things cross over, and where things do cross over in modern day living are the areas of the body that are just, as you rightly say, are getting tighter and tighter. So we sit, but now we sit for longer because we're a nation of desk workers. So we're sitting at desks, and that psoas muscle you were referring to, it's just getting tighter and tighter. So if the lower body's getting tighter, the upper body's a reflection of that is going to get tighter as well. And the other area that we get tighter is the neck. And that directly correlates to our pulse rate and our heart rate. So the stress in the body from tightness in the psoas and tightness in the upper neck muscles is going to keep us practically in fight or flight, really, in a distress signal that's on 24 hours a day, And there's so many people in the Western world that we're living like this on a daily basis with our alarm systems on high alert. And so basic breathing practices, they're not going to touch it, because we're not teaching people how to release, as you say, release these areas of tightness that correlate to the breathing pathways in the body, and also to be able to understand where the breath is moving in the body. We don't think about it. People just breathe in and breathe out. Sometimes they use their mouth, sometimes they use their nose, but they don't even understand that concept of how to slow the breath down enough that they're then accessing these muscles at the same time, because there's many things going on in yogic breathing that are not going on in regular breathing. Would you agree that?
Yeah. I mean, if we're going to involve, I mean, obviously what differentiates a yogic breath with some of these techniques that we mentioned before that are out there, these breath hacks, what differentiates it is, in fact, the respiratory diaphragm. And when we involve the respiratory diaphragm, which requires us to widen the breath here. And as you pointed out, most people haven't got a handle on how to widen the breath. And if the psoas muscle is restricting the diaphragm, then the ability to use these, the lateral muscles of the rib cage is going to be non-existent. And you're going to get this kind of, upper trapped breath in the upper respiratory
Yeah,
chain.
it jumps up. Exactly. It jumps up. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so what we want to cultivate is an opening of the respiratory diaphragm, isn't it? And a widening of the breath there. And I think then once we've got that, as we were explaining before, what differentiates yogic breathing is the pelvic floor and how, the science of exhaling for longer actually allows for a fuller, deeper inhale. And that's something else that perhaps is beginning to be diluted in many approaches to yoga because it's very fast and lots of vinyasa flows is all about constantly moving the body. And when you're constantly moving the body, you don't have the opportunity to slow down the exhale to meet the pelvic floor. And when we meet the pelvic floor, there is, because of the nerves branching from the pelvic bowl and the sacral, the back of the pelvis, the sacrum, which are connected to the rest and digest aspect of the nervous system, we miss out on the ability to take a fuller, deeper and wider inhale.
Wider inhale. Yeah, yeah. And,
So
and a lower inhale.
a lower inhale. So I don't know whether you want to pick up on that physiology, because I know your knowledge is very much in the physiology of the body, Siobhan. What's your take on how we are, missing out the pelvic floor in classes today?
We're missing out that whole connection to the nervous system. We're missing out that whole connection to calm.
Yeah.
And even though we might feel or taste a little bit of some of these, and I'll put them in the category of more fad breathing techniques because there's no lineage or major science or longer science evidence to say, this is going to change your body over time. It's just absolutely not.
Talk a little bit, can we talk a little bit about the science that has actually been researched at the schools and the teachers? So I'd just like to mention our teacher. We both studied with Paul Dallahan, who's, I think his PhD was almost 10 years stressing the breath. And you met him in 2005. I started studying with him in 2003. And Paul is very much connected to Kaivalayadhama. And Kaivalayadhama partnered with Paul Dallahan via this 10-year PhD. And when we look at the research of the Kaivalayadhama, that's 100 years.
100 years
of research.
Of research, what a wonderful, wonderful legacy to leave to us students. We're so very lucky to have had that as our experience of breathing practices with Paul, that introduction through Paul to such a phenomenal institute. And even today, what they're doing in research with regards to research is incredible. With regards to mental health, with regards to cancer, with regards to healing in the body, recovery. But it all comes back to what we're talking about today, which is the physiological aspects of the mechanisms of the breath, because unless we really get that concept at the beginning, and I think the other important thing here, Vicky, is it's not something we just pick up like that. It takes time, and sometimes it can take, we all come to it, like we said at the beginning. Everybody comes to the yoga from, for different timelines in their life, and what's come before in their life, So you could have someone with major trauma and someone with literally no trauma in their life, but maybe very stressed or busy work life, so the comparison in those two people is very, very relevant in how long it perhaps takes them to unravel
That's right. Yeah.
what's going on in their own system. And for some people, that can be quite overwhelming as well. So I think that's another important note to add in, that, if we access things slowly and
Yeah.
gradually and we work on it, but we work on it the right way, then the difference is transformative. It,
And
and it's for life. It's not just something we pick up and put down again. It's something we've got as a coping mechanism for the rest of our life.
yeah.
And we get the juice out of that. And I think the other thing versus other breathing practices is that what the Kaivalayadhama have done with research and with progressive breathing means that, studying with you, Vicky, studying with me, we're both 20 years plus working with these breathing practices now. So it's established in our system. And I think it's really, really important for any viewer to know that studying with someone who's only practiced breathing for a year or so, you're not going to get the quality or the depth that you get from studying with someone who's experientially had it in their system for as long as we have. And with regards to the Kaivalayadhama, that 100 years of research is absolutely phenomenal, because the proof is there, the science is there and the proof is there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing about yogic breathing is it's not just a spiritual, a lot of people think of going, oh, I don't want to do that because it's quite spiritual and it's this, but your whole concept of yoga and breathing is a science, it's a science based on what we're doing physiologically, which is what we're talking about today, and then what we can progress to, maybe talk about in some later meetups, is about ratios and how much we can progress and how phenomenally transformative that is to go even deeper again. So I know we're just touching the surface today, but it's something that evolves with you. And I think that's the real difference, is once we get the breathing mechanisms working, then it's like we've been put on that travelator, and that travelator is going to follow with us into the rest of our life, and it becomes deeper in us, and our nervous system settles so incredibly.
Yeah. I mean,
You
just
know,
picking up on what you said about it takes time. I mean, the teacher training that I run is over 11 months, and we start with the breath, and we make sure that is the strongest thread throughout the course.
throughout the course.
Feedback that I get is phenomenal, really, and I have, doctors and GPs and psychologists and mums and people who want to teach yoga in weekly classes. But the feedback that I'm getting is the most important thing that's been illuminated to them is how by changing the breath, it has changed their life. It's changed their nervous system. It's tapping into the yamas and the niyamas, because as you are calmer, your relationship with yourself is improved, your relationship with other people is improved. So without a doubt, the breath is the absolutely most important fundamental element of a rounded yoga practice. And as you said, we want to talk a little bit more about going deeper into pranayama, but today we just wanted to really underpin the importance of the breath as the most important element.
The breath as the most, and we're accessing those other things, as you rightly say, through the breath. And the lovely point that I maybe like to bring up here, Vicky, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, is that through accessing the breath in the correct way, we're accessing those other aspects of self, which are linked into mindfulness. You know, that it's incredible how much mindfulness comes up. And the reason I'm touching on this is because it comes up naturally. It comes up naturally and without effort
Yeah.
through the breath. And that's huge. And that's exactly what's happening, because for people listening that don't know about yamas and niyamas, it's how we stop and pause and take stock of what we're eating, or how we're treating other people. And in mindfulness, you know, if we use mindfulness as a standalone practice without accessing the breath, and it's just a mindfulness class, that can be extremely hard for someone to do when they're not in a state of calm, you know. So
Yeah.
through the breath, it's the only way, in
Yeah.
my opinion, and in science's opinion, it's the only way to lead our life in the best and the most fruitful way ever, for the benefit for our own well-being.
And
Um,
maybe we can finish there, which is a beautiful way to kind of end it, really, which is actually the meaning of yoga, which is that second Yoga Sutra, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which actually means, just as you've rightly pointed out, you know, it's a channelization of the mental frame. And what that means is the mind and the breath are connected. We know that when we get anxious, the mind becomes more activated. We can go back to the stories of the past in an anxious way. We can be anxious about the future. But what we want to do is to come back to this present moment, which is ultimately the meaning of yoga, is to find a deep presence. And we do that. And as you pointed out, you know, the word mindfulness is a buzzword today, which ultimately is a very Buddhist term really. You know, our teacher Tuariji would say, from mindful to mindless. That's what I always laugh that Tuariji always says that phrase, because we want to be able to empty the mind in a way to become into this present moment and to find that stillness.
yes, and then everything else takes off from there.
So maybe we should finish it there.
We
Thank you.
should, we should finish it there. Thank you so much, Vicky.